Hi, Paul here, and I'm going to quickly talk about some important techniques that you can use to optimize importing and processing data into a Power BI data model and report. So let's just start with a quick diagram and talk about how data flows into Power BI. So whenever you are building a report and a data model, we start with a data source. Let's just call this our source data. Now, you may have many of these data sources, but we'll just take a look at one of them. So the next step is the connection. So we connect to some kind of data source. It could be an Excel file, text file, SQL Server database, web service, could be just about anything. So that's our connection. Once we connect, we import data, and that flows into potentially multiple steps that we'll call data transformations or transforms. So we could have multiple steps in this transformation process. And once we've changed data types, renamed columns, rearranged things, pivoted, manipulated our data, then it's time to bring that data into the actual data model. Now, each query is going to result in a separate table within the model, and those tables are going to be wired together with relationships, which is what forms the tabular model. On top of that tabular model, then, we have calculations. In a simple model, they may just be simple aggregates, sums or averages, or we may have more complex measures that are all written using DAX expressions. And then once we have those measures or aggregations, then we can start building report visuals. So there's my model. And that's the whole process in a nutshell. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper. Now, in the interest of time for this demonstration, I have a very simple query. I've connected to an Excel workbook. I've chosen to use Excel just because it takes a little more work to manipulate that data than if I were connecting to something like SQL Server. So I'm connecting to my Excel workbook, and you can see that I navigate to the tables and the sheets, and then I choose a sheet. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I need to promote these headers in this worksheet, and that generates this step called sheet table promoted. And those are all of the automatic steps that I get. Now, I'm going to keep going now, and you can see that I have a number of columns that are kind of cryptically named, and my columns were not automatically changed to the right data type. So I'm going to start renaming things. So we'll just go up here and we'll call that sales space key. And then I'm also going to change that to the correct data type. That's a whole number. You can see that for every step, that's going to generate these steps over here under the applied steps. So I'm going to rename the store key, and then I'm going to change that to an integer, and I'll change this column to the name product key, and I'll change that to a whole number, and on and on. Now, we'll actually do a few more steps, and I'm going to do a cooking show demo here. I'm going to actually rearrange some columns. So here I've got my order date key. Let's change that one to a whole number. And I'll rename this column as well. Also, I have a column in here that has the date value of the order date key. And I want those to sit next to each other for whatever reason. And again, you can see that I'm generating all of these steps, and the tool simply applies these logical but not necessarily intuitive names to each of these steps, putting ones at the end. I've renamed a column here, and I've renamed another column, so it puts a number at the end, renamed column again, puts a 2 on the end, and I'm going to fast forward to a version of this query where I've generated a whole bunch of steps just by doing some simple transforms, renaming some things, changing the data types, rearranging columns. You can imagine that I could be doing grouping, I could be doing merging, pivoting. We could do all kinds of things, and I'll end up with a whole bunch of steps. Now, the problem here is that because I rename a column and then change the data type, then rename another column, then change the data type, it creates all of these different steps. Now, if rather than doing that, I had renamed this column, okay, and you'll see a new rename column, columns 4, and then I keep renaming columns, the Power Query Editor is going to start consolidating the same steps when they're all performed together. And if you look at the rename columns for step, you can see that each column that I rename is consolidated into that step. If I were to go back and change the data type of promotion key, you'll see that that's going to create a step called change type 3. But if I keep changing data types, it's going to consolidate that step. So if I can do all of the same types of steps together, they get consolidated and I end up with fewer steps. So here's an example of where I've made a point to do that. Now, I performed all of the same actions here, where you can see that I ended up with 16 different change type steps. And then in my consolidated version, I've done exactly the same thing and I have only one change type step, only one removed other columns step, and only one reordered column step. But does it really make a difference? Well, let's go find out. Now, if I go to this query, remember that these two queries for demonstration purposes are exactly the same thing. They have the same outcome. I'm going to go to the Tools menu, and I'm going to start Diagnostics. This is a fairly new feature that will trace these steps and provide timings. I'm going to go back to the Home tab, and I'm going to click Refresh Preview. And when that's done, we'll go back to Tools, and we'll stop Diagnostics. What that will do is it will add a pair of queries. Needs to finish writing out that metadata. You can see that here's a query called Diagnostics with today's date, down to the second, and then a Diagnostics detail step. And you can see that if I look at the outcome here, it shows each and every step, all of the actions that it was performing, and it shows the start time and the end time and the duration of each of those steps. Now, Cooking Show Demo, I'm going to go back and show you where I've done diagnostics on my, and the total duration was 22.25 seconds. Then I did the same thing, started diagnostics, captured those diagnostics on my consolidated query, and you can see that the total time was 6 seconds. It took about 25% of the time when I consolidated those steps. So that's a very simple thing that you can do to optimize your Power BI models and save yourself a lot of time and work.